Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we begin Mrs. Pringle of Fairacre by Miss Reed. Miss Reed is the author and the protagonist of these books and is a village school teacher in the English Midlands, writing in the 1960s. Chapter 1, Face to Face. It is snowing again. We shall certainly have a white Christmas this year, a rare occurrence even in this downland village of Fairacre. I have been the head teacher of Fairacre School for more years than I care to remember, and the schoolhouse where I write this has been my home for all that time. It is particularly snug at the moment. The fire blazes, the cat is stretched out in front of it, and Christmas cards line the mantelpiece. Very soon the school breaks up for the Christmas holidays, and what a comforting thought that is. Comfort is needed, not only from the snowflakes which whisper at the window, but also from the aftermath of a recent skirmish with Mrs. Pringle, our school cleaner, who has lived in the village even longer than I have. She does her job superbly, but is a sore trial. It is generally agreed that she is difficult, the vicar's expression, and a proper tartar, as Bob Willett, our handyman and school caretaker, puts it. During term, our paths cross on most days. It is no wonder that I relish the school holidays and the peace that they bring. How long, I muse, putting another log on the fire, will I be able to stand her aggression? Stroking Tibby's warm stomach, I look back through the years at my tempestuous relationship at Fairacre School with the doughty Mrs. Pringle. I first encountered Mrs. Pringle one thundery July afternoon. It was a Friday, I remember. The vicar, the Reverend Gerald Partridge, who was chairman of the school governors, had invited me to tea before looking over the schoolhouse, which was to become my home at the end of the month. I had recently been appointed headmistress of Fairacre School. There were puddles in the playground, and we splashed through them on our way to the schoolhouse. A strange mooing noise, as of a cow or a calf in distress, was coming from the deserted school building. The children of Fairacre had already started their summer holiday. "That," said Mr. Partridge, "is Mrs. Pringle, our school cleaner. It sounds as though she is singing a hymn. She is in the church choir." We paused for a moment, listening to the distant voice and the plop of raindrops into puddles. "I don't recognize it," I ventured. "Probably the descant," replied the vicar. He did not sound very sure. "In any case, perhaps I should take you to meet her before we visit the house." We changed direction, and the vicar pushed open the door into the lobby. Mrs. Pringle, bucket at her feet and floor-cloth in the other, stood before us. She was short and stout. Her expression was dour. She made no attempt to smile, offer a hand, or make any other gesture of welcome as the vicar introduced us. Eventually, she jerked her head towards the floor, where our feet had made wet prints. "I just done that," she remarked, the 4 words dropping as cold and flat as the stones upon which we stood. Although I did not know it at the time, it was the first shot in a war which was to last for many years. I was the first woman to be appointed head teacher of Fairacre School, and I looked forward eagerly to taking up my duties. The downland village and the market town of Caxley were known to me, for my good friend Amy, who had been with me at college, had married and lived south of Caxley in the village of Bent. On my frequent weekend visits, we explored the countryside and often drove up to the downs for a picnic and an exhilarating walk. We drove through the villages of Beech Green and Fairacre and sometimes stopped to look round their churches or to buy something from Beech Green's village shop. When I had seen the headship of Fairacre School advertised in the Times Educational Supplement, I had applied for the post. "I'm not likely to get it," I said to Amy. "I doubt if I shall even get called to an interview." "Rubbish," said Amy stoutly. "You are better qualified than most, and I'm positive you'll get the job." Although I was grateful for this display of support, biased though it was, I had private misgivings. Consequently, when I was appointed, I felt both pride and trepidation. Could I fulfill the governor's hopes, and would the children and parents be cooperative? I need not have worried. Any initial suspicions or doubts on the part of the inhabitants of Fairacre were soon hidden from me, and as years passed I was accepted as part of the village community. I could never expect to be in the same category as a native born and bred in Fairacre, but to be welcomed was quite enough for me. But on that humid, thundery afternoon I was still at the apprehensive stage, and my encounter with the school cleaner aroused my fears. I tried to put them aside as I followed the vicar round my new home. It was a snug, well-built house with a good-sized sitting room and a decent kitchen flanked by a small dining room. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms and a tiny box room later destined to be a bathroom. At that time the house was empty, for my predecessor, Mr. Fortescue, had moved out just before his retirement. It was Mrs. Pringle, the vicar told me, who had a key and kept the premises clean. In fact, went on the vicar, she has cared for this house for many years. I see, I said, my heart sinking. Of course, it is entirely up to you, but if you felt like continuing to employ her, I'm sure she would carry on. Thank you for telling me. She really is a wonderful worker, persisted the vicar as we went out into the dripping garden. Her manner is a little off-putting, I know, but she is diligent and honest and has always taken a great pride in her work. I did not reply, determined not to commit myself at this stage to being hostess to Mrs. Pringle for years to come. What a lovely garden, I said, changing the subject. There were a few mature fruit trees displaying small unripe apples, plums, and pears, and an impressive herbaceous border flaunting lupins, delphiniums, and oriental poppies. The flowers were looking rather battered from the recent rain, the border was undoubtedly weedy, and the garden shaggy, but basically it was a splendid garden, and my spirits rose. Yes, Mr. Willett gives a hand, said the vicar. In fact, he gives a hand at most of our activities, as you will find. He drew out a watch from his waistcoat pocket. Dear, dear, I think we should get back to the vicarage. My wife will have tea ready. We retraced our steps to rejoin Mrs. Partridge and Amy, who had brought me over, and who had spent the time, I later learned, in unraveling the sleeve of a cardigan which the vicar's wife was engaged upon. She had misread the directions for increasing, and the sleeve was ballooning in an alarming fashion, to say nothing of using up all the wool before the whole thing was finished. As the vicar and I walked up the drive to our tea, he returned to the subject of Mrs. Pringle. Do consider the matter of employing her, he urged. I feel sure she is expecting it. He sounded, I thought, somewhat nervous. Was he frightened of the lady, I wondered? Was she really as fearsome as she undoubtedly looked? It only strengthened my determination not to commit myself. I'll certainly consider it, I assured him as he opened the front door. Ah, good, he replied, sounding much relieved. And good again, I think I can smell toasted tea cakes. On the way back to Bent, I prattled happily to Amy about the schoolhouse and garden and how much I looked forward to living there. You must let me give you a hand in getting it ready, said Amy, hooting at a pheasant who strolled haughtily across the road, intent on suicide. I should enjoy your company, I replied. It's not so much my company, said Amy severely, as my advice you will need. You know you've never been much good at measuring accurately, and I haven't much opinion of your sense of color. Well, thank you, I said, trying not to sound nettled. That is the worst of friends who have known you from youth. They remember all your faults, which one has done one's best to eradicate over the years. However, Amy always means well, despite her undoubted bossiness, and on this occasion I managed not to answer back. In any case, I reminded myself I had done quite a few memories of Amy's early indiscretions, and should have no hesitation in using them if she continued to rake up the infirmities in my own past. But I was too euphoric about my future to take serious offense at Amy's car swished through the puddles. The sky remained lowering, and it was obvious that the thunderstorm was not yet over. Of course, the garden needs tidying, I continued, but the vicar seems to think that someone called Bob Willett will give a hand. I must get in touch with him. And what about the house? I felt a slight pang as I recalled Mrs. Pringle's visage, quite as dark and menacing as the sky overhead. "Well," I began, "the school cleaner seems to have looked after the head teacher's house before, but I didn't really take to her." "Taking to her or not," said Amy, "is beside the point. You're not exactly the model housewife, as you well know. I should advise you to take whatever domestic help is offered." "But Amy," I protested, "you haven't seen this Mrs. Pringle. She's quite formidable. Why, I believe the vicar himself is afraid of her, and after all, he's girt about with righteousness and all the other Christian armament. What hope for a defenseless woman like me?" "You exaggerate," replied Amy, swinging neatly into her drive. "I'll come over with you next time and meet the lady." What a clash of dinosaurs that could be, I thought with some relish as I clambered from the car. James, Amy's husband, proved to be a welcome ally later that evening when the subject of help in my new abode cropped up. "I shouldn't saddle myself with that lady if I were you," he said. "Fob her off. Say you want to see how things work out. Play for time." "My feeling entirely," I responded. "I didn't like to press Mr. Partridge too much. He seems so anxious not to offend her, but perhaps a few discreet inquiries among other villagers would be useful. This Bob Willett might be helpful." "There are no such things as discreet inquiries in a village," said James. "Everything is known within a flash. I should make up your own mind. Keep your ears open, by all means, but your mouth shut. I was brought up in a village, and I know what I'm talking about." "I've had some experience in living in a village myself," I responded, "but not as one of the pillars of society, as I suppose I will be in Fairacre. I shall have to watch my step." "If you're going to be a public figure," remarked Amy, "and an example of right living to the children and their parents, I should think that a clean house might be the first step in the right direction." She sounded rather waspish, I thought, probably rather cross with James for taking my part. "Well, I haven't turned down Mrs. Pringle absolutely flat," I pointed out, "but I'm not going to be rushed into anything." "Wise girl," commented James. Amy gave a snort. In bed later, I recalled the pleasures of my first sight of the school and garden. It gave me great joy to remember the pleasant rooms awaiting my furniture and the pretty garden awaiting urgent attention by both Bob Willett and me. I refused to be put off by the malevolent shade of Mrs. Pringle. "A mere fly in the ointment," I said aloud, settling into my pillow. I fell asleep within minutes. Chapter 2. Settling in. What with one thing and another, it was the beginning of August before I could make my next visit to Fairacre. Amy, hospitable as ever, was going to put me up, but I made the journey by train and then caught one of the rare buses which went from Caxley to Fairacre. It was market day in the little town, and the stall-holders were doing a brisk trade in the square. It was hot and noisy, and my case was heavy. I was glad to climb aboard the bus and find a seat. Fairacre was several miles distant, and the bus chugged gently uphill from the valley of the river Cax, stopping at the villages for laden shoppers to alight. At Beech Green, the village before Fairacre, the bus stopped beside the village school, and I wondered who my next-door colleague might be. It was a scorching afternoon, the very best time to see this downland country. In some distant fields, harvest had already started. Combines crawled like gigantic toys around the fields. The hedges were heavy with summer foliage, still starred here and there with late wild roses and the creamy flatheads of elderflowers. The grass on the roadside banks was sun-bleached, and as the bus swished by, it undulated like ripe corn before a strong wind. Amy was coming to pick me up at the schoolhouse at 4:30, and meanwhile I had over 2 hours in which to visit Mr. Willett, the post office, and best of all, my new house and garden. It was no wonder that my spirits were high as we rattled toward Fairacre. Mr. Willett was hoeing in his remarkably neat vegetable patch. Despite the heat, he was wearing a cap, and although he was in his shirt sleeves, he had a tweed waistcoat as his outer garment. After greetings and my compliments on his vegetables, I broached the subject of help in the garden and at the schoolhouse. "Now, I was hoping you'd be along," said Mr. Willett. "I've looked after that for more years than I can count. It may look a bit rough at the moment, as I didn't like to be too forward and trespass-like in there when I'd not been given permission." But you'll come? Of course I'll come. Be up tomorrow evening if you like. There's a row of shallots should be lifted by now. I wondered if I ought to do that, but thought Mrs. Pringle might catch sight of me and tell all and sundry I was pinching 'em. This gave me an opening for further inquiries. Mr. Willett pushed his cap back and leant heavily on his hoe. Let's put it this way. I don't like to speak ill of anyone, he began, obviously about to do just that. But you wants to start as you means to go on with that one. I'm not saying she's all bad. She done a lot for us when my Alice was took ill one winter, but she's a proper moaner. If you gets a smile out of her, you'll be the first as has. Well, thank you for telling me. Forewarned is forearmed, so they say. It isn't her arms is the trouble with her, it's her legs. She's got one that gives her more to trouble, so she says, and everyone else comes to that too when she's crossed in any way. Ah, yes, Mrs. Pringle's leg is a force to be reckoned with, as you'll find. We walked together to the gate. You letting her do your house cleaning? He asked, coming to the point with a directness I already respected. I haven't decided. You think it over well, Miss Reed. 'Tis easy enough to ask people in, and a darn sight more tricky to get 'em out. Not that she isn't a good worker, I will say that, he added. I'll be over tomorrow evening, I promised, and we'll look at the garden together. I'll tell Alice you called. She's over at Springborn on some WI lark. She'll want to hear all about you. And so will the rest of Fairacre, I surmised, as I made my way to the post office. After the few obligatory comments on the weather, nice to see the sun, but the peas need some rain to plump up, I introduced myself to Mr. Lamb. Hope you'll be very happy here, he said, shaking my hand. Thought it was you getting off the bus. Been to see Bob Willett? As a matter of fact, I have. Good chap, Bob. Going to give you a hand in the garden? I hope so. Nothing that chap can't turn his hand to. Looks after the school of Fairtree and the church and graveyard. And always cheery. He stopped suddenly. You met Mrs. Pringle yet? I said that I had. She'll be cleaning the school still, I suppose? I said that I hoped so. Excuse me asking, but is she going to work for you, too, in the house, I mean? I said I had not yet made up my mind. Mr. Lamb gave a sigh. It sounded like one of relief. Yes, well, she's a good worker, I'll grant, but I'd take time in deciding to have her regular myself. I thanked him, bought some stamps and a packet of biscuits, and made my way to the schoolhouse. Amy had already arrived and was wandering about the garden. She was smiling in a dreamy fashion. What a blissful spot, absolute peace. There was an ancient bench lodged against the house wall. It looked as though it had once been part of the furnishings of Fairacre School in Queen Victoria's reign. We settled ourselves upon it, turning our faces up to the sun. Some shaggy Mrs. Sinkin pinks wafted their scent toward us. 2 inquisitive chaffinches surveyed us in a yard of our feet, and far away some sheep bleated from the downland. To sit in the shade and look upon verdure, I quoted. Except we're not in the shade, Amy pointed out, and I shall be done to a frizzle if I stay here too long. By the way, I brought a flask of tea. You marvelous girl, and I've got some rich tea biscuits. My word, you are going it, commented Amy. Well, it was either rich tea or Garibaldi from the post office, so I settled for rich tea. After all, they'll do for cheese as well. Very prudent, said Amy. She went to the car to fetch the flask, and I hastily shifted my weight to the center of the bench, which buckled alarmingly when Amy left it. We could have it inside, I said. I've got the key. Better out here, Amy replied. Besides, I don't suppose there's anything to sit on in there. She was quite right, of course. We sipped our tea. The chaffinches had flown to a nearby plum tree, but kept a sharp lookout for crumbs. Of course, you'll have to put in a lot of work on this garden, said Amy, becoming her usual brisk self. It's been terribly neglected. I told her about my visit to Mr. Willett. Sounds hopeful, she concluded. And this Mrs. Pringle? As if on cue, I heard the click of the garden gate, and round the corner of the house stumped a thick-set figure with a black oilcloth bag over her arm. Mrs. Pringle had arrived. And we'll see the three-way confrontation of Mrs. Pringle, Miss Reed, and Amy next time.